The Voidwall Barrier had stood at the edge of the Chronos sector for approximately 14,000 galactic standard years, which was quite impressive for something that technically shouldn't exist according to 17 different schools of physics. Yet there it was, shimmering with that particular shade of absolutely not, that made even the most optimistic scientists reach for their resignation letters. It wasn't a wall in the traditional sense. Walls, after all, were constructed by someone with architectural ambitions and questionable zoning permits. The void wall simply was a membrane between normal space and whatever cosmic joke lay beyond it, stretching across 3 light years of space like someone had decided to wallpaper the universe and given up halfway through. Ships approached it, sensors went haywire, physics took a coffee break, and anything that tried to pass through discovered that the laws of thermodynamics had some very strong opinions about trespassing. The hierarchy of United Stellar Nations, that delightful collection of species, who enjoyed committee meetings and color-coded threat assessments, had classified the void wall as a Category Omega phenomenon. Category Omega was reserved for things that made scientists wake up screaming and philosophers question their career choices. In layman's terms, it meant, don't touch, don't approach, don't even think too hard about it unless you enjoyed your molecules in their current arrangement. Naturally, everyone had tried to break through it anyway. The Yavathi, with their crystalline bioships and delusions of adequacy, had thrown themselves at the barrier for 3 centuries. Their approach involved harmonizing quantum frequencies with their neural matrices, which sounded impressive at dinner parties, but ultimately resulted in a lot of very expensive ships becoming very expensive modern art installations. Frozen in the barrier's edge, their crystalline hulls refracted light in ways that local tourism boards called hauntingly beautiful and insurance companies called a complete write-off. The Drenthic Collective, mechanical beings who viewed biological life with the same disdain humans reserved for instruction manuals, had attempted a more direct approach. They'd constructed a drilling apparatus, the size of a small moon, powered by a dying star they'd specifically murdered for the occasion. The drill had lasted approximately 4 seconds before the void wall simply absorbed it, adding insult to injury by spitting out a perfectly geometric cube of compressed metal 3 days later. The Drenthic didn't appreciate the gesture. Even the architects, those insufferable energy beings who claimed to have witnessed the birth of the universe and wouldn't shut up about it at social gatherings, had admitted defeat. They'd attempted to phase through the barrier using dimensional manipulation that operated on mathematical principles most species couldn't pronounce. The result was 12 architects stuck halfway between dimensions, creating an awkward situation that required a rescue operation costing more than most planetary defense budgets. The architects stopped bragging about their cosmic seniority after the 14,000 years of failure had created a comfortable consensus. The void wall was eternal, unbreakable, and frankly quite rude about the whole thing. Scientists published papers about its theoretical composition. Philosophers wrote treatises on its metaphysical implications. Religious movements formed around it, because apparently nothing inspired faith quite like a giant cosmic middle finger to conventional physics. The barrier had become a universal constant, like gravity or the inevitability of awkward silences in elevators. You simply accepted it, worked around it, and maybe took your holiday photos in front of it, if you were the type who enjoyed existential dread with your vacation snapshots. Then the humans showed up, and the universe prepared itself for the inevitable headache. Humanity had joined the galactic community approximately 2 centuries prior, emerging from their little blue marble with the enthusiasm of toddlers in a china shop, and the self-preservation instincts of particularly suicidal lemmings. They discovered faster-than-light travel by accident, established first contact by barging through a military quarantine zone, because they thought the warning buoys were just suggestions, and had somehow avoided starting 3 separate wars through a combination of genuine friendliness and weaponized confusion. The galaxy had watched with mounting concern as humans bounced around known space, pointing at things and asking "but why though?" with the persistence of a species that had apparently evolved without a healthy sense of fear. They'd attempted to colonize gas giants, befriend hive minds that communicated through aggressive spores, and had once tried to diplomatically negotiate with a black hole because, quote, it seemed lonely. When the humans heard about the Voidwall Barrier, their reaction wasn't reverence or scientific curiosity or even healthy fear. It was, and this worried several dozen species immensely, genuine excitement. They looked at 14,000 years of failure, and saw it not as a warning but as a challenge. Worse, They saw it as entertainment. The Galactic Institute of Advanced Phenomena, that august body of scientists who treated the universe like a particularly complex puzzle box, received the human application with the enthusiasm usually reserved for tax audit. Dr. Fenwick Hale, a human with the kind of smile that made security personnel reach for their stun batons, wanted to study the Voidwall. His credentials were impeccable, his research proposals were actually quite brilliant, and his team had that distinctly human quality of looking at impossible problems and saying, "Hold my beverage." The Institute, after 6 months of deliberation and 3 separate psychological evaluations of the human applicants, approved the research mission, mostly because refusing humans only made them more interested, and at least this way they could monitor the inevitable disaster from a safe distance. They assigned a supervisory committee of 23 senior scientists from various species, all of whom began updating their resumes the moment the humans arrived. The human research vessel, named the Audacity, because humans possessed exactly 0 self-awareness, docked at Research Station Gamma, overlooking the Voidwall. It was smaller than expected, held together with what appeared to be optimism and spare parts, and had a coffee maker that somehow drew more power than the life support systems. The station's AI, a sophisticated Drenthic program that had calculated trajectories for 11,000 scientific missions, took one look at the human ship's maintenance logs, and immediately filed for hazard pay. Dr. Hale emerged from the airlock with his team, carrying equipment that made the station's sensors have what could only be described as an electronic anxiety attack. The supervisory committee, representing the finest scientific minds in the galaxy, greeted them with prepared speeches about safety protocols, ethical considerations, and the importance of not doing anything catastrophically stupid. The humans listened politely, nodded at appropriate intervals, and everyone present knew with absolute certainty that they were going to ignore every single word. The galaxy had survived 14,000 years of the Voidwall Barrier remaining unbroken. What it wasn't prepared for was what happened when you gave a human a problem everyone agreed was impossible, then told them they absolutely shouldn't try to solve it. Spoiler alert, that's basically catnip for humans. Dr. Fenwick Hale stood before the assembled supervisory committee in Conference Room 7, which had been specifically designed to withstand high-energy phenomena, and more recently, human presentation. The room's dampening fields could contain a small nuclear explosion, though whether that was for the experiments or the humans remained diplomatically unspecified. Hale had brought visual aids, which should have been the first warning sign. Right then, he began pulling up a holographic display that immediately made 3 Yavathi scientists flinch. "We've reviewed approximately 4,000 years of your documented attempts at breaching the Voidwall. Fascinating stuff, really. Very thorough. Extremely scientific." He paused, and his smile widened in a way that made the committee collectively lean back. Also completely backwards, but points for consistency. Ambassador Wexit of the hierarchy, a dignified Nitharian whose species had perfected the art of diplomatic condescension over 6 millennia, raised one crystalline appendage. "Dr. Hale, perhaps you could elaborate on how 14,000 years of cumulative scientific effort could be categorized as backwards." "Oh, absolutely." Hale advanced his presentation to a graph that appeared to have been drawn by someone having a seizure. "See, everyone's been treating the Voidwall like it's a locked door. Very reasonable assumption. Door won't open, you try different keys, more advanced keys, quantum keys, keys that operate on 17 dimensions simultaneously. Classic problem-solving approach. And the flaw in this methodology," Wexit's tone could have flash-frozen hydrogen. "It's not a door." Hale said this like he was explaining that water was wet. "It's a membrane. Specifically, it's a semi-permeable barrier operating on variable frequency modulation that shifts based on energy input. You've all been trying to break through when you should be asking nicely." The silence that followed could have suffocated small planet. Dr. Yenthis, a Drenthic scientist whose computational matrix had survived 3 stellar collapses and now deeply regretted that resilience, processed this statement for exactly 4 seconds before responding. "You're suggesting we negotiate with a spatial anomaly." "What? No, don't be ridiculous." Hale laughed, and several committee members relaxed slightly. "I'm saying we need to figure out what frequency it wants and give it that. It's like," he paused, searching for an analogy. "You know when you have a really annoying door that only opens if you jiggle the handle just right while standing on one foot? It's that, but with quantum mechanics and existential dread." The committee exchanged looks that required no translation. The look said, "This human is going to get us all killed, converted into strange matter, or published in a cautionary tale that future civilizations will use to teach their children about hubris. Hale's team, meanwhile, had begun unpacking their equipment in the station's primary laboratory, which previously held the record for most safety protocols per square meter. Dr. Imani Osei, the team's theoretical physicist, was setting up what appeared to be a collection of random electronics held together with electrical tape and sheer willpower. Her colleague, engineer Bruno Costanza, was arguing with the station's automated systems about whether their gear constituted a safety hazard. "It's not a bomb," Bruno insisted to the increasingly frantic AI. "It's a frequency modulator." The difference the AI's voice dripped with synthetic sarcasm, which was impressive for a machine. "One is designed to explode, the other might explode. Totally different." Grentix, the station's head of security and a Vorthian who had spent 4 decades ensuring nothing exciting ever happened on his watch, observed the humans with the wary attention of someone watching a child play with matches near a fuel depot. "Explain in terms that won't require me to evacuate the station what that device does." Imani looked up from her work adjusting a component that was definitely not meant to connect to the thing she was connecting it to. "It's a resonance detector. We're going to scan the void wall across every conceivable frequency spectrum until we find the one that makes it go weird. The barrier already violates 9 fundamental laws of physics. It cannot become more weird." "Challenge accepted," Imani said cheerfully. What the galactic scientific community had failed to grasp about humans was their fundamental approach to problem solving, which could be summarized as try everything, document nothing properly, and see what happens. It was a methodology that made traditional scientists develop stress-induced molting patterns and caused AI systems to generate error logs that read like existential poetry. The Yavathi had spent 3 centuries developing harmonization theories based on 17,000-page mathematical proofs. The humans had brought a device that literally just went beep at different frequencies until something interesting happened. This wasn't elegant. It wasn't sophisticated. It was the scientific equivalent of shaking a vending machine until your snack fell out. And the truly terrifying part, it had a non-zero chance of working. Over the next 6 days, the supervisory committee watched with mounting horror as the humans systematically violated every established protocol for studying category omega phenomena. They pointed sensors at the void wall that specifically weren't designed for that purpose. They ran experiments without filing proper documentation first. They had lunch breaks in the middle of critical calibrations because, quote, "the sandwich place closes at 2 and they do this amazing thing with pastrami." Dr. Hale's approach to the void wall involved what he called percussive maintenance philosophy. If something didn't work, try hitting it with different types of energy until something changed. The committee's attempts to explain that the barrier had withstood stellar-level energy impacts were met with Hale nodding thoughtfully and then doing exactly what he was planning to do anyway. "The thing is," Hale explained during one particularly excruciating briefing, "everyone's been hitting it with more energy. Bigger ships, stronger weapons, higher frequencies, very impressive displays of technological prowess. But nobody's tried less," Ambassador Wexith repeated, the word emerging like a death rattle. "Exactly. What if the void wall isn't blocking you because you're not strong enough? What if it's blocking you because you're trying too hard?" Hale pulled up a new diagram that made the committee's collective blood pressure spike. "Everything that's touched it has been hostile. Drilling, forcing, hammering. What if we just knock politely?" The conceptual framework Hale presented was simultaneously brilliant and absolutely deranged. Instead of treating the void wall as an obstacle to be overcome through force, he proposed treating it as a system to be understood through observation. His team would map every frequency response, every energy fluctuation, every minute variation in the barrier's composition across its 3-light-year span. Then, armed with that data, they'd find the precise frequency at which the void wall became permeable. It was elegant. It was theoretically sound. It was based on solid scientific principles that the galaxy had somehow missed because everyone was too busy throwing bigger weapons at the problem. It was also being executed by humans, which meant the gap between theory and practice was roughly the size of a small galaxy and filled with improvisation, coffee, and concerning amounts of duct tape. Bruno finished assembling their primary scanning array on day 7. It looked like something that had been rejected from a scrapyard for being too ugly, then rejected from a second scrapyard for lowering property values. It hummed when activated, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that it hummed in a key that made organic beings' teeth ache, and caused the station's structural supports to vibrate sympathetically. "That seems suboptimal,"
Grentix observed, his hand resting on the emergency evacuation alarm. It's supposed to do that, Bruno assured him. Probably. The scanning process began at 0800 station time, which the humans had specifically chosen because the night shift supervisor was less likely to stop them. The device projected a beam of modulated energy at the void wall, cycling through frequencies at a rate that made traditional sensors give up and display error messages in languages that didn't exist yet. The void wall, which had spent 14,000 years ignoring everything thrown at it with the indifference of a cosmic bouncer, did something unexpected. It flickered, just for a microsecond, in a bandwidth so narrow that conventional sensors would have missed it entirely. The barrier's density dropped by 0.003%. It was so small that it barely qualified as a chain. It was also the first measurable variation in the void wall's consistency in recorded history. Every alarm in the observation deck activated simultaneously. Scientists from 17 species scrambled to their station. Ambassador Wexith actually stood up, which for an Etherian indicated either extreme interest or imminent cardiac arrest. Hale looked at his team's readings, then at the void wall, then back at the readings. His expression suggested someone who'd just realized they'd accidentally kicked open a door they thought was fake. "Huh," he said with the casual tone of someone who'd just discovered something that would rewrite fundamental physics. "So that's interesting." The galaxy, watching through remote feeds and sensor relays, collectively held its breath. The humans had found something. Whether that something was a breakthrough or a new and creative way to destroy everything within a parsec, remained to be determined. Knowing humans, it was probably both.
The discovery of the flicker sparked what could only be described as controlled pandemonium, if one loosely defined controlled, as nobody had actually died yet. The supervisory committee convened an emergency session that lasted 47 minutes and accomplished absolutely nothing except generating paperwork. The humans, meanwhile, had already moved to phase 2 of their plan, which they'd neglected to mention existed. "When you said you were going to scan the barrier," Ambassador Wexith said, his translucent form rippling with what his species expressed as barely contained fury, "you failed to mention phase 2 involved actually interacting with it." Hale looked genuinely confused by the objection. "Well, obviously. What's the point of finding the right frequency if we don't use it? That's like discovering the recipe for cake and then not eating cake. Actually, that's worse. That's a crime against cake. The void wall has destroyed or absorbed everything that's attempted passage for 14 millennia. Sure, but they were using the wrong frequency. We've got the right one now." Hale gestured to Amani, who was recalibrating their equipment with the focused intensity of someone defusing a bomb, assuming the bomb was also judging her technique. "Probably. 73% confidence, which is honestly better odds than most things humans do." Dr. Yenthis, whose mechanical form had begun emitting a high-pitched whine that his species associated with existential dread, processed this statement. "You're basing a category omega interaction on 73% confidence. Rounding up from 68, but who's counting?" The committee attempted to halt the experiment through official channels, which involved filing injunctions, calling emergency votes, and appealing to various safety protocols written specifically to prevent this exact scenario. The humans responded by nodding seriously, promising to definitely consider all feedback, and then doing exactly what they were going to do anyway, but with slightly more caution tape around the equipment. The modified scanning array now pointed directly at the section of void wall where they detected the flicker. Bruno had enhanced it with additional components that he described as technically experimental, and the station AI described as violations of physics that would make quarks file harassment complaints. The device now resembled what might happen if a particle accelerator and a music synthesizer had a child. Then that child made very poor life choices. "The theory," Amani explained to the assembled observers, most of whom were present to witness history or document the disaster for insurance purposes, is that the void wall isn't solid. It's a waveform interference pattern operating across multiple dimensional frequencies. Everything that's hit it before created destructive interference, which reinforced the barrier. We're going to create constructive interference. You're going to sing to it, Grentix said flatly. Technically, we're going to match its resonant frequency and essentially convince it we're supposed to be here. Like showing up to a party with the right password. And if the password is wrong, Amani glanced at her calculations, then at the void wall, then back at Grentix. Then we'll probably get converted into exotic particles, scattered across 7 dimensions or possibly turned inside out. Results unclear. This is insanity. Yeah, but it's scientific insanity, which means we get published either way. The human capacity for treating existential threats as minor inconveniences had been documented extensively by xenopsychologists who'd written approximately 40,000 papers on the subject and concluded that humans either possessed a fundamentally different relationship with mortality or were collectively suffering from some species-wide psychological condition. The fact that humanity had survived long enough to reach spacefaring status was considered evidence that the universe had a sense of humor. Hale gave the go-ahead at 14:30 station time, chosen because it was after lunch but before dinner, minimizing the number of people who'd die on an empty stomach if everything went catastrophically wrong. The device activated with a sound that made reality question its life choices. The beam of modulated energy struck the void wall at precisely the frequency they'd calculated, adjusted for 17 different variables, and calibrated to a tolerance that would have been impressive if it wasn't being generated by equipment held together with optimism and cable tie. The barrier, which had spent 14,000 years being imperviously solid, rippled, not flickered, rippled. Like dropping a stone in a pond, concentric waves spread from the impact point, traveling across the barrier's surface, in patterns that made the observation deck sensors attempt to commit electronic suicide. The ripples were visible to the naked eye, which shouldn't have been possible for something that technically existed in 17 dimensions simultaneous. "Oh, that's not supposed to happen," Bruno said, which were words specifically designed to trigger cardiovascular incidents in anyone listening. "Which part isn't supposed to happen?" Grentix's hand was now permanently attached to the evacuation alarm. The visible. The equation said the frequency matching would be quantum level, not macroscopic. "This is," Bruno trailed off, doing rapid calculations on a tablet while the void wall continued behaving in ways that violated its 14,000-year operational history. "This is actually way better than expected." The ripples continued spreading, and where they passed, the barrier's density fluctuated. Not much. Readings showed variations between 0.1 and 0.7%. But enough to register on instruments that had been specifically built to measure the void wall's legendary immutability. Several research stations orbiting the phenomenon began transmitting emergency alerts, assuming their sensors had malfunctioned. When they realized the readings were accurate, they began transmitting different emergency alerts that essentially translated to what the Imani increased the modulation frequency by 0.3%, adjusting for a harmonic they'd detected in the ripple pattern. The void wall's response was immediate and dramatic. The ripples intensified, and at the exact point where the beam made contact, the barrier began to not disappear. Even human audacity had limits, but its density dropped to 47% of normal, creating a section of weakened space roughly the size of a small spacecraft. "We could punch through that," Hale said, staring at the readings with the expression of someone who just realized they'd accidentally kicked in the door to a bank vault and found it unlocked. "Absolutely not," every other being in the observation deck said simultaneously. "But theoretically, no." The committee descended into chaos, which for a scientific body meant raised voices, angry gestures, and someone from the Vorthian delegation actually swearing in 3 languages. They'd convened to study the void wall, not breach. There were protocols, procedures, approximately 7,000 pages of documentation that needed to be filed before attempting passage through a Category Omega phenomenon. This was reckless, dangerous, and completely unacceptable. The humans naturally had already launched a probe. "When did you?" Ambassador Wexit's question died as he watched the small automated device accelerate toward the weakened section of barrier. "You prepared a probe before receiving authorization." "We prepared 6 probes," Hale corrected cheerfully. "This is probe number 3. Probes 1 and 2 were for testing the launch system, which in retrospect maybe should have been mentioned during the briefing. The probe reached the void wall at 4. Every sensor on the station locked onto it, recording at maximum resolution because this was either going to be the most significant scientific breakthrough in galactic history, or the most expensive explosion anyone had ever documented, possibly both. The probe touched the weakened barrier, and in defiance of 14,000 years of precedent, went through. Not easily, not cleanly. The passage looked like watching something force its way through solidified gelatin, while the gelatin actively resented the intrusion. The probe's hull creaked loud enough to register on audio sensors. Its shielding fluctuated wildly, and approximately 30% of its exterior sensors simply stopped working. presumably after deciding they didn't want to experience whatever was happening to them. But it went through. The observation deck fell silent in a way that transcended mere absence of sound. This was the silence of fundamentally altered reality, of scientific consensus collapsing, of every expert simultaneously realizing their expertise had just been rendered obsolete by a species that had invented spaceflight by accident and considered safety regulations to be light suggestion. The probe emerged on the other side of the void wall and transmitted a single image before its communication systems failed. The image showed a region of space that looked remarkably normal, which was somehow more disturbing than if it had shown tentacled horrors or geometric impossibility. Just stars, dust clouds, and the cosmic backdrop that suggested the universe beyond the barrier was disappointingly mundane. Then the probe exploded, but at that point, everyone had stopped caring because the important part had already happened. The humans had broken the unbreakable barrier by treating it like a locked door and jiggling the handle correctly. Hale turned to the committee with a smile that would haunt their nightmares for decades. So who wants to volunteer for the manned mission? The collective response involved 17 different languages, but the sentiment was universal, consisted of approximately 2 words, and would not be appearing in any official reports. The galaxy had spent 14,000 years accepting the void wall as an eternal constant. The humans had spent 6 days turning that constant into a variable, and they'd done it with equipment that looked like it had been assembled during a clearance sale at a surplus store. The worst part from the committee's perspective wasn't that the humans had succeeded, it was that they were already planning Phase 3 and nobody had any idea what Phase 3 involved because the humans kept forgetting to file the proper documentation. Somewhere in the cosmic bureaucracy that governed universal constants and fundamental physics, someone had just gotten a very concerning memo about humans and was seriously reconsidering their life choices. The barrier had been broken. The question now was what came next and whether the galaxy's insurance policies covered human-induced reality revision. The galactic scientific community's response to the void wall breach could be categorized into 5 distinct phases: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and frantically rewriting every physics textbook published in the last 6 millennia. Several prominent research institutions experienced all 5 phases simultaneously, which created fascinating case studies for psychologists and contributed to a notable increase in stress leave applications across 17 species. The hierarchy convened an emergency session within hours of the probe's successful passage, which was impressive given that most emergency sessions required 3 weeks of preliminary scheduling and catering arrangements. Representatives from 47 member species gathered virtually, their holographic forms flickering with what the technicians assured everyone was signal interference and definitely not existential dread. "Explain," High Chancellor Ventress demanded, his ancient form radiating the kind of displeasure usually reserved for cosmic catastrophes and really disappointing lunch buffets. "Explain how a barrier that has resisted every concentrated effort for 14,000 years, was compromised by 3 humans and equipment that appears to have been constructed from recycled spare parts." Hale, attending via the station's communication system, looked genuinely puzzled by the question. While everyone else was trying to break through it, we just asked nicely. Different approach, different results. You asked a spatial anomaly nicely. We matched its frequency, which is basically the same thing, like when you knock on a door at the right rhythm and someone lets you in. Except the door is a multidimensional barrier, and the knocking is concentrated beams of modulated energy that operate on quantum principle. But fundamentally same concept. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded either enlightenment or violence, and the betting pools across the galaxy were split 50-50 on which would arrive first. Dr. Yenthis, who'd spent the last 6 hours running diagnostics on every sensor that had recorded the breach, finally spoke. "The data is consistent. The barrier's density decreased by 62% at the point of frequency match. The probe achieved passage, albeit with significant structural damage. This shouldn't be possible according to 17 different fundamental theories. Maybe the theories were wrong," Imani suggested helpfully. "The theories were developed over millennia by the finest minds across known space." "Sure, but they were wrong though, because we just did the thing they said was impossible, which, and I'm just thinking out loud here, suggests the theories needed updating." The academic establishment's reaction to this suggestion ranged from outraged sputtering to the kind of profound silence that indicated someone's worldview was actively collapsing. The Yuvathi delegation began harmonizing in distress patterns. 3 Drenthic scientists experienced critical errors in their computational matrices and required rebooting,
One architect simply phased out of the meeting entirely, presumably to rethink its understanding of reality somewhere private. What made the situation exponentially worse was that Hale's team had already begun preparing for a manned transit, not hypothetically, not pending authorization. They'd started prepping a small shuttle within 2 hours of the probe's successful passage, because humans apparently interpreted catastrophically dangerous unprecedented phenomenon as fun weekend activity. The probe was destroyed, Ambassador Wexford pointed out, his tone suggesting he was clinging to this fact like a drowning man to driftwood. Completely annihilated seconds after passage. Yeah, but it got through first, which proves the concept works. We just need better shield. Hale pulled up specifications for their shuttle modifications, which made the assembled representatives wish they hadn't asked. We're reinforcing the hull with layered frequency dampeners, installing redundant power systems, and Bruno's adding what he calls vibes-based structural enhancements, which I don't fully understand but he seems confident about. Vibes-based, Ventress repeated, each syllable dripping with the accumulated horror of 6 centuries of existence. He means resonance stabilization, Imani translated. But yeah, also vibes. The hierarchy attempted to block the manned mission through every available channel. They invoked safety regulations that predated most current civilizations. They cited protocols specifically written to prevent exactly this scenario. They appealed to common sense, basic survival instincts, and the fundamental desire not to be converted into exotic particle. The humans responded by nodding thoughtfully, promising to absolutely take all concerns into consideration, and then filing a flight plan for the following morning. What the galaxy was slowly horrifyingly realizing was that humans possessed a fundamentally different relationship with danger than every other known species. Where rational beings saw catastrophic risk and responded with appropriate caution, humans saw catastrophic risk and thought, but what if we just tried anyway? This wasn't bravery or foolishness. Those implied conscious choice. This was something more fundamental, a species-wide inability to accept that some things simply couldn't be done. The shuttle launch occurred at 0630 station time, early enough that most of the supervisory committee was still in regeneration cycles, and couldn't physically interfere. Hale piloted, because of course he did, with Imani handling navigation and Bruno managing systems that had been modified so extensively they barely resembled their original specification. The vessel, optimistically named, Probably Fine, had been cleared for flight by exactly nobody but launched anyway. Grentix, who'd arrived at the observation deck to find the shuttle already accelerating toward the void wall, experienced what his species called a crisis of professional purpose. He'd spent 4 decades ensuring nothing interesting happened on his watch, and now humans had turned his station into ground zero for rewriting fundamental physics. His resignation letter was already half written in his head. The shuttle approached the barrier, its modified frequency generators activating in sequence. The void wall rippled in response, recognizing the harmonic pattern, density decreasing at the approach vector. Every active sensor within 3 light-years locked onto the shuttle, recording what was either going to be the most significant moment in modern science, or the most expensive disaster in recent memory. Approaching contact point, Hale reported, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone parallel parking, rather than attempting something that had killed hundreds of previous attempts. Barrier density at 49% and dropping. Hull integrity holding. Bruno, how are those vibes are immaculate, Bruno confirmed, monitoring displays that showed the shuttle's structural resonance matching the void wall's frequency pattern. We're harmonizing beautifully. I'm almost emotional about it. The shuttle touched the barrier at 0. Unlike the probe which had forced its way through like a bullet through rubber, the shuttle slipped into the weakened space almost gracefully. The passage still looked violent. Space itself seemed to resist the intrusion, the barrier's surface churning around the vessel, but the shuttle's reinforced structure held. Sensors registered strain levels that should have torn the hull apart. The frequency dampeners burned through power at rates that made the engineering staff watching from the station genuinely nauseous. But the shuttle went through. It emerged on the far side at 0649, exactly 97 seconds after initial contact. The hull bore scorch marks and stress fractures. Approximately 40% of external sensors had failed. The coffee maker had somehow started brewing despite being powered down, but the shuttle was intact. The crew was alive and they'd just accomplished something the galaxy had considered fundamentally impossible for longer than most civilizations had possessed: written language. Well, Hale transmitted back to the station, his voice crackling through the barrier's interference. That was moderately terrifying. 10 out of 10. Would not recommend for anyone with a functioning survival instinct. Imani, remind me to never do that again. You're already planning the second transit, aren't you? Obviously, but I'm still going to complain about the first one. It's called having standard. The galaxy watched through transmitted feeds as the shuttle conducted a brief survey of the space beyond the void wall, which turned out to be disappointingly normal. No cosmic horrors, no dimensional anomaly, just regular space that had been inaccessible because everyone had been trying too hard to reach it. The anticlimax was almost insulting. The return journey, conducted 3 hours later, after the humans had eaten lunch and taken what they called a brief existential processing break, went smoother than the first passage. They'd refined the frequency matching, adjusted the approach angle, and apparently Bruno's vibes had really clicked with the barrier's energy. The shuttle returned with minimal additional damage, and the crew emerged looking tired, slightly singed, and unreasonably pleased with themselves. The scientific papers that followed numbered in the thousands. The void wall, it turned out, wasn't actually a barrier in the traditional sense. It was a resonance phenomenon, a standing wave in spacetime that had accidentally created a 3-light-year wall of absolutely not through cosmic coincidence. Matching its frequency didn't break it, it simply convinced the phenomenon that you belonged there, like showing security a valid ID badge. The principle was elegant, theoretically sound, and had somehow eluded every major scientific institution for 14,000 years, while being discovered by 3 humans in less than a week. The galactic response oscillated between admiration and profound resentment. Hale's team received approximately 17,000 award nominations and 43 death threats, which they considered a pretty good ratio. The hierarchy officially recognized their achievement while simultaneously creating new safety categories, specifically to prevent humans from doing anything similar in the future. Research institutions began frantically reviewing other impossible phenomena, terrified of what humans might casually solve next. The void wall, meanwhile, became significantly less interesting once people knew how to pass through it. Transit stations were established. Regular crossings became routine. Within 2 years, the legendary unbreakable barrier was reduced to a moderately inconvenient checkpoint that required frequency matching and patience. Tourism boards struggled to market it. The mystique had died, murdered by 3 humans and equipment that still looked like it had been assembled during a clearance sale. High Chancellor Ventress, reflecting on the incident during a private moment, experienced what his species called philosophical vertigo. The galaxy had spent 14,000 years accepting certain limits as fundamental truths, building entire civilizations around the concept that some things simply couldn't be done. Then humans arrived and treated those limits as mildly inconvenient suggestions. What other impossible things were simply waiting for someone reckless enough to ignore conventional wisdom? The thought was terrifying. The thought was exhilarating. The thought made him reach for medication that didn't exist yet. Dr. Hale, when asked during an interview about his team's success, shrugged with the casual indifference that had become his trademark. The barrier wasn't unbreakable. Everyone just assumed it was because nobody had found the right approach yet. We're not smarter than anyone else. We just didn't know we were supposed to fail, so we tried stuff until something worked. Which was, the interviewer realized, possibly the most human statement ever uttered. The galaxy had operated on the principle that wisdom meant accepting limitation. Humans operated on the principle that limitations were just problems nobody had solved yet. And also, maybe let's try hitting it with frequency-modulated energy to see what happens. Somewhere in the cosmic bureaucracy that governed universal constants, someone was absolutely updating the risk assessment protocols for humans. The category had moved from mild concern to please keep them away from anything we consider fundamental to reality. But the protocols wouldn't matter. The galaxy had learned an important lesson about humans, one that would echo through centuries of future interaction. Tell a human something is impossible, provide them with 14,000 years of documented failure, and assign a supervisory committee to ensure they don't do anything dangerous, then step back and watch them do it anyway, probably before lunch, using equipment that violates safety regulations and a methodology best described as organized chaos, with excellent results. The void wall had stood for 14,000 years, unbroken and eternal. It took humans 6 days to turn it into a footnote in history. The galaxy would never be quite sure whether to thank them or file harassment charges against the entire species. Probably both. Definitely.